Hello shape enthusiasts. Last episode we went through how to work with some of these trickier crystal shapes where there is a crystal overhang. We used this as an example where we had a crystal layer sitting on top of an empty gap, and we showed you how to use that by creating a temporary shatterable crystal layer and then piecing that together from quarters and then shattering away the crystal to get an overhanging shape held up by a scaffold, and then piecing it together with the real shape, and finally creating our desired shape. Now that's all well and good for shapes where there is a crystal layer held up by a non-crystal layer with a gap underneath, but there is an even more trickier shape, which is something like this, where you see a crystal layer held up by nothing and a gap directly underneath the crystal. In insane mode, you'll see examples of this shape in the final task, as well as the final milestone, where you just have a naked crystal overhang. Now you might be asking, why doesn't the same technique work with a naked crystal overhang? Well, let's take a look. The technique I showed in the last guide basically revolves around shattering away this temporary crystal after we place on the actual crystal part that we want. So we want this, and we want the gap underneath. And if we cut this shape basically down the middle, this red crystal will shatter, leaving you with the gap that you want. But what if we didn't have this circle in the middle? So here I've just modified my process to remove that second circle layer. So now we just have our shatterable crystal, and we're putting our scaffold directly on top and creating a crystal shape that looks like this. And you'd think, okay, well, it's the same concept, right? If I shatter away this, it'll create a gap underneath the crystal directly. But if you look at what's actually happening over here when it's being shattered, you'll notice that the crystal is actually completely gone. And why is that? Well, the reason this is happening is because when you shatter a crystal, it destroys all crystals that are touching it. So the blue crystal that you want to keep is being shattered when you cut this shape in half, because it's directly touching the red crystal. So unfortunately, to make this shape, it's actually not possible to do it this way. So then how would you make a shape like this with a naked crystal overhang and a gap directly underneath? Well, let's simplify the example using a shape like this. It still has the exact same concept. We've got a crystal layer with a gap underneath and a shape underneath that. So how would we make this? So from here, we know that this quarter is very easy to make. It's just two circles, and then if we just scaffold a quarter blue crystal, that's not a problem. But let's focus on this quarter with the gap. So we're essentially trying to make this. Now our last technique showed you whenever that you need a gap, you just put a crystal layer where you want the gap, and then if you cut it in half, it will create the gap. However, that's not going to work in this case because the crystals are touching. So when you shatter away this crystal to create your gap, you're going to destroy the crystal that you actually want to keep. So how do we work around this? Well, what if we swapped layers 2 and layers 1 and did something like this? Well, now when you shatter the crystals aren't touching anymore. But if you shatter away this crystal, you're just going to end up with these two shapes and they're going to fall down. But if you had scaffolding the way we showed it before, it'll just sort of hold up in midair. However, we want a gap in between these two crystals. So we're going to need a very special scaffold. So instead of our usual full shape scaffold, what if we used pinned scaffolds like this? So we're going to pin up the bit that's holding onto the crystal that we want to dangle in midair. Now I want you to imagine what will happen if we shatter away the red crystal. When we shatter away the red crystal, our shape is going to look like this. But this is an impossible shape because this second layer is not being held up by anything. So you can imagine what's going to happen from here is that the second layer is simply just going to fall down to the first layer. After the shape has fallen down to the first layer like this, we can see this pinned up scaffold is now holding up our crystal layer. We have a gap underneath the crystal, and then the shape that we want underneath that gap has now fallen into place. And that is what we're going to try to make. Let's see how that works in practice. So very similarly to the last shape that we made, we want to start with a half mold to make our shatterable red crystal on the bottom layer. So I'll give this thing a 180-degree rotation followed by a half destroy. That'll get our scaffold ready. Let's bring our red paint and get a crystal generator. And there's our first layer done. Now again, temporarily, we're just trying to produce sort of this shape. So we've got to get a circle here and a scaffold over here for the blue. Very similar to what we did last guide. So let's bring our circle belt like that. Then we will get a bent stacker, making sure that this layer is on the bottom and this layer is on top. Now we've got our quarter circle on top of our shatterable red crystal. Now we just need to get a scaffold on top of this, and then we can put the blue crystal on. So we'll get our scaffold, jump that over. We'll get that rotated correctly. So it's a clockwise rotation, so that the scaffold hole is on the bottom left where we want it. We'll just grab another bent stacker over here, put that on the bottom layer and put that above there. Now that pretty much gets us the final shape that we want with a hole for the blue crystal. So let's get the blue in. So there's our blue, there's our shape. Let's put that through another crystal maker. And we can see now we have the shape that we want with the shatterable crystal portion, and it's inside a scaffold. Now we can get rid of the right half, but we can't shatter away the red yet. So let's get a 180-degree rotation and a half destroy. Now that leaves us with this shape, which is almost what we want, but not quite. Remember, when we shatter away the red crystal portion of it, we want just the shape part to fall, but not the crystal part to fall. So we need our pinned bit over here. As a reminder, we want something like this. I know there's a bit of extra shape in our actual process, but that doesn't affect anything. So let's try to put this shape on top, which is just a quarter circle pinned up twice. We can use our full circle, or we can use our scaffold, doesn't really matter, whatever you want to do. To turn that into a quarter, we just half destroy, counterclockwise rotate, and half destroy again. Now we need to pin push that twice to get it onto the layer that we need it. Then we'll just bring it over, and we want to put it to where we want to hold it up. So in our example, we need it on the top left. Give that a counterclockwise rotation. And now we can swap these into place. Remember, because this has crystals on it and we can't use a stacker. Well, we can stack this onto this if we wanted to, but for simplicity, we will just use a swapper. And now let's have a look at what shape is coming out of here. Now we've got the pinned up part holding up the blue crystal, and we've got the shatterable red crystal ready to go. So we can imagine if we put it onto, say, this side, and we cut this thing down the middle, what's going to happen is that this is all going to get destroyed. It's going to destroy the red crystal, and nothing's going to be holding up this second layer anymore, so it should fall down. Let's see what that looks like in practice. We'll give that a 90 degrees clockwise rotation to get it into place, and now we will simply give that a half destroy. Now if we look at the shape that's coming out of here, we can see we've got our crystal, a gap, and then a shape underneath, held up by this pin push thing. But obviously we want to get rid of the pin push thing because it's not part of our final shape. We want to hold this blue crystal up now with the real shape. So the example shape we're trying to make is this, and we can see the real part that's going to hold this up is just 2 quarter circles followed by a blue crystal on top. So we can very easily make that. We will do it separately over here. So I'm just going to take 2 circles, and then I'm going to take another scaffold, and we just need to stack this all into place. So we'll start with a stacker that can go up, and then we just need to stack these 2. This is on the bottom, this is on top, and now we have our shape ready to go. 3 layers and a gap for the crystal, so we just need the blue crystal over here. So I'll bring my blue, we'll get another crystal maker, and just like that, we've got the quarter that we're interested in. We can cut away all the bits that we don't want. We'll get a half destroyer, counterclockwise rotation, another half destroyer, and now we have the quarter that we do want. Let's bring these together. Now we want this quarter to be in the bottom left so that it can hold up this shape. So let's give that a 180 degree rotation. Then it's just a simple matter of swapping these 2 together. And now we can see that the real shape is now holding up this gapped shape, and we no longer need this scaffold. So we can cut away the scaffold, give that a counterclockwise rotation, give that a half destroy, and now we're left with exactly the shape that we want. And we can now build this again somewhere else and then just swap them together to make the full shape. For the example that I'm using, my shape is symmetrical, so I'm just going to take a copy of my shape and then merge it together for the example. But obviously in reality, you may not have a perfectly symmetrical shape, so you would follow the same process and modify it accordingly to make the other half of the shape and swap those two bits together. So here I'm just going to rotate one half of it 180 degrees and put it through a swapper, just to show you the full shape with the gap. And you can see this shape has a crystal overhang onto a gap with nothing in it, with a shape underneath, and that is pretty much the same concept as, say, this shape. You would build this almost in the identical way that I've shown in the video, of course with white and cyan instead of blue and uncolored, but that's all easy compared to actually doing the crystal part of the shape. That's pretty much the hardest challenge the game is going to throw at you. So now we've pretty much figured out all the different crystal tricks the game's going to throw at you, which is basically the incomplete crystal, which teaches you that you have to piece shapes together by quarter instead of by layer. Then you've got your overhanging crystals, where it teaches you that you need to use scaffolding to hold bits of the shape up as you shatter away crystals to create gaps underneath. And finally, progressing to the most difficult one, which is a naked crystal overhang, where you've got a crystal shape directly overhanging a gap, which teaches you that you need to use special scaffolding to create it with the shape underneath and then drop the shape. So just a quick review. Over here, we've got our scaffolded shape with the shatterable crystal, but our shape is in the wrong layer. We're using this special scaffold with pins to hold that up. Then when we shatter away the bit that we don't want, the pinned layer is only holding up the layer that we do want, and the bit that was underneath here is now falling down because nothing is holding it up. And that's the technique that you want to follow to get yourself shapes that look like this. And once you've mastered this technique, you've pretty much figured out how to make every single shape in the game, and the next big challenge is to make a MAM that can do this automatically. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and sub, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.